Good morning. Thank you so much, Mitch, for the wonderful introduction, and for you and the organizing committee for inviting me here, and especially to the audience for coming under such trying times. I have to say, this is my third trip to Israel in about 20 years, and I've learned so much more about Israel and the people and the resilience, under these circumstances than in my prior trips. So I'm really happy that everybody's here. I'm going to be talking to you at the moment about some of the mechanisms of impaired hand function in cerebral palsy, spastic hemiplegia. And Mitch asked me to fill in just a couple days ago because there was a cancellation, and I very quickly put together some slides. So if it's a bit haphazard, the big picture that I'm trying to get across is I want to lead into my original talk, my second talk, on intervention. And the idea is that intervention needs to be driven by understanding of these mechanisms of the particular impairments and how children learn and so forth. So I'll start with the requisite slide of where I'm from. I'm from the city of Atlantis. I'm in New York City. As you know, we had a rather large storm, and this is the part of Manhattan that was particularly affected. We live in a relatively high altitude, about 50 meters above sea level, so we didn't have a problem at Columbia University. You can see that it's a relatively old university in terms of American standards anyway. The architecture is quite nice, with the exception of where I work. I work probably in the ugliest building at Columbia University, named after the eminent psychologist Edward Thorndike. They say that beauty is on the inside. It's not. It's ugly there too. So just a quick overview of what it is that I do and what I'll be talking about. The second part of the intervention is going to focus on development and testing of rehabilitation protocols. So what I have the pleasure to talk to you about now is some of the work that drives that intervention work, as I said, basically understanding movement disorders, and particularly hand function and cerebral palsy. This is driven by some of my more basic research in systems neuroscience, motor control in typically developing children and adults. And well, what I want to show you is that these areas are really intertwined, and they're really important to be thinking about perhaps some of these other issues that ultimately lead us to rehabilitation. I think everybody here can appreciate the importance of the human hand in terms of hand function, tool use, sensory exploration, and basically some of the things that make us uniquely human, the arts. You're also mostly familiar with the symptoms of cerebral palsy or hemiplegia, but perhaps a couple of the less appreciated components that we'll talk about is, in addition to motor execution problems, which we'll review briefly, individuals with CP have impaired motor planning and impaired motor learning, and we'll talk a little bit about the implications of those particular impairments. So, as you know, the hand function is largely controlled or innervated by the cortical spinal tract, and in fact, its integrity as a result of the lesions and neurological damage is largely predictive of the hand function. And this is one way to look at it, is just to quantify basically the damage, basically either with an MRI and measure the ratio between the cerebral spinal, the CST passing through the cerebral peduncles, or using DTI and basically quantifying the area of the tracts. And in fact, the extent to which the damage occurs is very much related to digital dexterity as related to the Purdue PEG test, box and blocks, manual dexterity, and the able hand kids. You can see it's pretty highly predictive of what the hand impairments will look like. So it's not only the amount of damage, but it's the timing of the damage that is important as well. So this is from the work of Martin Stout. Basically, he quantified motor dysfunction. So basically a higher score means worse hand function. The white circles mean actually individuals who have the normal contralateral projection as measured with TMS of basically the motor cortex projecting to the contralateral hand, whereas the filled circles represent individuals who are unable to who do not have tracts that basically cross over the midline, and largely the ipsilateral motor cortex is innervating the affected upper extremity, and bilateral are the ones that are mixed here. Importantly, you can see that basically the later, overall, the later the damage during development, the worse the hand function it's going to occur. And it's obviously there's some overlap, but timing of the insult largely is going to predict the type of compensation that's going to subsequently occur. This kind of relates what I just mentioned, the contralateral versus ipsilateral and mixed tracts, as basically looking at in hand function. This is the box and block, so the higher score is a better score here. So those who have preserved contralateral innervation of the affected hand, on average, have better hand function as compared to those with either mixed or ipsilateral innervation. We know that individuals, obviously, in addition to their motor impairments, have sensory problems. And I think those are largely underappreciated, particularly when people are thinking about the phenomena of developmental disuse. Why does a child who has capabilities, at least motorically, choose not to use their affected hand? And the reality is that sometimes it just doesn't feel right. They're not getting appropriate sensations to do so. They have impaired movement execution. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is try to quantify this beyond just clinical examination. So we do a number of different laboratory-based movement analyses. This is finger individuation. The task is simply one by one to move a digit into flexion and extension while keeping all the other digits stationary. So it's not particularly functional, but it measures basically the ability to individuate digits. So I'm not going to go through a lot of detail about this, but this is a typically developing child on the left. And this is flexion extension of the thumb. And you can see that pretty much all the other digits stay still. And if you basically create a ratio of this to the other digits, it comes out to 0.9, meaning you get about 90% of, well, basically one would be a perfect individuation and 0 would be all the fingers moving together. So you're getting very, very good individuation. And it's a bit lower. A bit lower for some of the other digits, but overall you can see that a typically developing child is capable of, in isolation, moving individual digits. This is a child with hemiplegia. You can see that, for example, when the child is instructed to move the index finger here, you see large movements of the middle ring and little finger as well. And so you can see that these indexes, we call them individuation indexes, are much lower, indicating co-commitment movements. So when we basically quantify that, as I just said, and across an average of all the children, this is the affected hand of a child, the children with hemiplegia. This is the less affected hand, and then these are the dominant and non-dominant hand of age-matched, typically developing children. So you can see that, relatively speaking, they do pretty well with their less affected hand, but they have large impairments, basically with the overall same pattern as the typically developing children, meaning that the thumb has the best individuation and middle ring tend to have the worst individuation. Okay, I will go into this. Okay, one of the ways that we've been studying the motor component of these impairments is examination of fingertip forces during grasping with the instrumented object. So this is basically from some of our earlier work back in Stockholm about 20 years ago. These are successive lifts of an object, basically of a typically developing adult. And you can see that this is the grip force, the squeeze force applied to the object. This is the vertical lift force opposing gravity. The rates of force increase and position. So you can see that from trial to trial, they're pretty consistent. Basically, the rates are unimodal, simply like you would see in a velocity profile that's well programmed, basically scaling these based upon their knowledge of the object's physical properties. So very little variability. This is basically, this is a typically developing child. This is a a child with CP, and what you can see is much, much more variation from trial to trial, both in terms of the timing and the actual force output. They often push down against the table to kind of stabilize the object into the hand, and they don't have very consistent unimodal force rate profiles. It's more sequential. So another thing that we realized relatively early on is that in addition to this movement execution component, superimposed onto this is impaired planning. So when we look at these digit forces, these are trials when children are asked to lift successively an object whose weight is either 200 or 400 grams. So this is on the 5th trial or so, consecutive trial with each of these. So you can see that the control subjects, they adapt their grip forces, so they're higher for the heavier object. And importantly, the rates of force increase, unimodal again, are scaled to the object's weight. So basically you have faster rates of force increase for the heavier object. This is about the 5th trial of a child with CP. They do use sensory feedback. They do use higher forces overall, but you can see there's large variations. It's a sequential force output, and the rates of force increase don't reflect the object's weight. They're not using any visual or prior memory or experience to drive the development of the forces. So this would reflect impaired motor planning. Another way of looking at planning, this was in the context of just grasp and lift an object, but a lot of objects that we handle are under more dynamic situations where you actually have to move the object. So we did an experiment with these children recently where the task is to hold on to the object and simply walk across the room. So in doing so, you're going to induce inertial forces onto the object as the object moves in a sinusoidal manner in space as the person walks across the room. So these are with peaks that are related in particular to heel strike, creates a large force right through the body and is superimposed onto transmitted to the object, and toe off. So this is the less affected hand, and this is what you would see in a typically developing child or adult in which we've done previous experiments with. If you look at the inertial forces, so basically the peak forces are shortly after heel strike, you can see that the grip force is in fact timed. So basically it's happening simultaneously, and that means that to do that, subjects have to anticipate when they're going to have heel strike and increase their forces accordingly. The alternative is either to do nothing and probably drop the object, or squeeze hard, and don't worry about it, but that's unfortunately be not energy cost effective. So you can see that the involved hand pretty much does what I just said. You can see that these are the inertial forces. The grip forces are completely random. There's no relationship between the fluctuations of grip force. So this also reflects impaired motor planning, but under dynamic circumstances. This is another experiment looking at planning. In this case, the shaping of the hand to 3 different shaped objects, a rectangle, convex and concave objects. So you can see that the final posture basically is different. And what we do is we do multiple trials of grasps to each of these objects, and at each point along the trajectory, we can use a discriminant analysis to determine to what extent our algorithms can determine which object they plan to grasp, which object are they going to ultimately end up reaching. So the idea being we create this visual motor efficiency index, with 100 being that 100% of the time you can tell that what particular shape they're going to grasp. So of course very early in the lift, reach, you can see that there's almost no relationship. It's just as a random prediction as to which object they're going to reach. And sorry, this is, blue is the typically developing child, by the way, and this is CP. But you can see that gradually the hand is shaped, and basically this is at the peak velocity, this is at object contact, and this is basically at lift. And you can see that overall the hand becomes molded to the object's particular shape, so that already there's a differentiation occurring at peak acceleration, and by the time they contact the object, about 85% of the time the algorithm can determine which object the hand is shaped towards. Kids with CP, you can see that there is shaping happening, but there's much more variability, there's much more overlap between the particular objects that they're going to grasp, and even at the end contact, the hand isn't particularly molded in a way that is easily discernible between the different objects. So the fact that this shaping is not occurring particularly early on also reflects impaired planning. So another aspect that we were surprised about, we had the opportunity to go back and look at some children who had participated 13 years prior when they were aged 6 to 8, now as basically late adolescents, around 19 to 21 years of age. So we don't know what happened in between, but we do know about a lot of the treatments that they had had. This is the Jebsen-Taylor test of hand function. It's just a timed battery of lifting or manipulating various objects, so the faster the time, the better. And these are children with hemiplegia and diplegia when they were 6 to 8 years of age and when they were 19 to 21 age. Basically what you can see is that in all cases, you see developing occurring. So basically they have improved their dexterity over this period. This is the average, but this is the average of typically developing children. And what you can see is that the slopes largely parallel. And the issue, of course, becomes how do we get this slope so that the endpoint more approximates that of the typically developing children. So there is development happening. This is something that is goes against what I was taught as a graduate student, but we're happy to see that even in the context of the various treatments and natural development, there is improvement that occurs. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but the idea is that when we look at these grip forces and the timing of these grip forces, you can see that compared to a typically developing adult, you can see these timing of various events are much longer in that they become shorter when the individual is older, but again, not that of a typical adult. Okay. Maybe the most impressive thing to me at that time was the idea that, yes, they have impaired planning, but with sufficient practice, they improve. That means that they have the possibility of learning, and with enough intensity, they can improve their hand function. So I just showed you these grip forces, and I showed you relatively early on in the learning curve, large differences. And these, basically, when we looked at this, we had initially, a few years before that, incorrectly interpret this as being impairments in motor control, impairments in motor planning. And I think most experiments do these sorts of things with children and adults. They take a few trials and then they basically kind of average them together, and you look at the outcome and differences and you try to interpret them. Well, the problem is that what we'll show you here is that even when we had these subjects coming into the lab to do these tasks, we saw marked improvement from the beginning of the experiment to about 1 hour later. So we actually quantified this in one study. This, of course, the typically developing child looks exactly like they did early on after 25 lifts. Here, after 25 lifts, you can see the child with CP now has much faster rates of force increase. You can see that they're unimodal, and the rates now are higher for the heavier object. They're beginning to anticipate they've extracted appropriate sensory information, and they're scaling their forces in an appropriate manner. So that means that they achieve not exactly the same behavior as the typically developing child, but much, much better performance over a much longer period of number of trials. And that means that, basically when we look at motor control, we need to consider motor learning, in that often we're just capturing the early slope. And it also means that the hand and other systems are likely amenable to improvement, provided enough intensity or consecutive movements here. The individuation that I showed you, basically we did a half an hour of training for 15 days, basically with tasks that are often done in monkeys, like putting food in a well and having them scoop out various food pellets or raisins and M&Ms and so forth. We bribe them, basically to elicit individuation. And we measured their individuation that I talked about before and after this 15-day treatment. And what you can see is that this is pre-treatment and this is post-treatment. So we can get about a 10 to 20%, depending on the digit, improvement in their ability to individuate their fingers. Now that's not function, it's purely execution, but the idea is that, if you can improve this, that you might be able to also elicit more functional grasp things. And that's something that needs to be explored further. So impaired hand function isn't static. It improves with development. It improves with training. I think everybody here can appreciate in hemiplegia, it's not simply the affected hand, but the less affected hand has some less appreciated impairments as well. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically these are the non-dominant the dominant hand of typically developing children, and the involved hand of kids with CP, and then the non-dominant as well. And so basically what you can see is, of course, the involved hand or a more affected hand is worse than both hands of the typically developing children and the less affected hand in all cases. But you can also see that the less affected hand is, in most cases, all these measures of grip force different than that of the typically developing children. So no matter, when we quantify these very precise behaviors, you actually can see some slight impairments in their grasp performance. Maybe more importantly, that something that isn't appreciated as much is that in addition to these unimanual impairments, there are impairments in bimanual controls above and beyond these unimanual impairments. So basically, this is a task we did where we asked subjects to open a drawer with one hand and reach inside and manipulate the contents with the other. So these are the velocity profiles of a typically developing child. And what you can see is that the hand reaches towards the drawer and then pulls it open. The other hand, with a very short delay, basically reaches towards the drawer and manipulates its contents. So that, one, there's a lot of overlap of these two movements of the two hands. And second, there's a short delay between opening the drawer and getting the hand inside. And that's pretty much what all of us would do. This is a child with CP, and you can see that only after they've reached and basically have opened the drawer do they even begin to initiate the movement. So there's very little overlap of the two hands. And you can see the delay between getting the drawer fully open and manipulating its contents is greatly prolonged. So there's a temporal spatial impairments in their ability to plan the movements of the two hands. I'm going to skip this, but in the force domain, that's also true in a task that you're asked to place an object down on top of another, and we just measure the forces between the two hands. And you also get that same, basically the same sort of sequential performance of the task. It's also an issue of, is there a role of the less affected hand? Even if it has slight impairments, can it provide a template for the performance of movements of the more affected hand? Well, I just showed you impairments in motor planning or fingertip forces during grasping for the involved hand. This reflects that. So this is the average of lifts with a 200 versus a 400 gram object, and you can see very little difference. In the less affected hand, you actually do see this force scaling or planning, and that means that basically this particular task, the planning deficits are specific only to the affected extremity. And that's something to think about, and I'm happy to talk to you about later as well. Basically, if you take if you lift the object first with the less affected hand, you begin to see it, and then you have them perform it with the affected hand. Basically, they begin to scale the forces to a greater extent. It's not perfect, but they were able to extract sensory attributes and motor attributes of lifting an object with their better hand for subsequent use with their less affected hand. And that's true even if they do the other way around, lift with their affected hand. They do extract appropriate sensory information, and then even if they can't do it under normal circumstances, when you subsequently transfer it to the less affected hand, they're capable of scaling the forces. So that means it's not purely a sensory problem, because they are transferring sensory information. It means it's a sensory integration problem, basically the integration of the sensory information for subsequent use of the same effector. A different study, we had subjects basically either grasp an object one at a time or two objects with both hands or basically simultaneously. So unimanual lifts basically are here. This is the grip force at load force onset. So typically you want a relatively small amount of grip force before you begin applying the lifting forces to an object. Children with CP, of course, have much higher forces. So when they perform it with the affected hand, basically it's much higher than the less affected hand. But when they grasp both objects simultaneously, what happens is that the forces in the affected hand actually decrease, and then the forces in the less affected hand increase to match it. But in any case, what you're doing is you're driving better performance of the affected hand during simultaneous motion of the hands. And this is something that you see in adult stroke patients as well. The consequence is that you can see it takes longer. So basically they have to concentrate to divide their attention between two objects simultaneously. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is issues related to motor learning. And this is really kind of lead into my second talk where we discuss motor learning-based approaches to upper extremity rehabilitation. But let's start with some simple definitions. Motor learning is defined as a set of processes involving practice and exercise leading to relatively stable changes in motor behavior. So this includes not only performance but retention when you bring children back. My colleague Anne Gentile, some of you may have heard of her from the Gentile taxonomy, and basically also defines skill. And skill is defined as the ability to consistently attain a goal with some economy of effort. And what I'm going to show you is a little clip with the ultimate idea that skill is the achievement of the goal rather than the movement form. This is a bit of what I would say it's motor learning history. This is Anne Gentile when more than 40 years ago lecturing to a physical education class. So the context is sport, but you can begin to see some of the seeds of the ideas that are going to subsequently affect rehabilitation. Oh, is there a sound?
Skill is simply accomplishing the goal consistently, regardless of how you do it. So that if some poor child takes the ball, goes down, falling apart, looks horrendous, shoots it up, and goes in every time, he's skilled. And this other gal dribbles down with marvelous form, shoots it up, misses, unskilled.
So it's the achievement of the end goal that matters, not the actual movement pattern or form that takes place to do this. I was asked, along with my friend and colleague Richard McGill, to write a chapter for the Physical Therapy for Children book by Suzanne Campbell and colleagues. It's actually kind of a challenging task to talk about what do we know about motor learning, not only in adults, but typically developing children and children with cerebral palsy. So I'm going to share with you everything that we learned about motor learning in CP. So to conclude this talk, no, I'm kidding, basically what we know is relatively little. Basically, there's very little information. So when we think about motor learning approaches to rehabilitation, which I'll come back to, you need to consider that we don't necessarily know what motor learning is in these individuals. But I'm going to share with you some of the bits of information and a few studies that we are aware of. We do know basically that performance improves with practice, as I showed you earlier. And we also, as I showed you, these children need more practice than typically developing children. Often in adult literature, they look at it in terms of, do you provide practice of the same activity consecutively, or do you mix up different activities? And it's typically thought that these random or mixing up of these activities leads to better retention. Basically, the few studies, or one study that we did, suggested that it doesn't really matter in these children, whether it's blocked or mixed practice. We know that in adults, what you want to do is sort of gradually take away feedback. So you don't give them feedback every trial, and they have to sort of learn to extract their own relevant sensory cues. Children, typically developing children, may benefit from increased feedback and basically a slow withdrawal of that feedback, especially for difficult tasks. And what we don't really know much about is how much feedback do these children need. My guess is that they're going to need considerably more external feedback, that they'll benefit from that, and extremely gradual withdrawal, if at all. This is an interesting component too. The issue would be, do you practice a particular movement that makes up a task, or do you practice the task itself? And this was an interesting Dutch study from about 20 years ago. And the task was basically to simply either take a wand, a stick, and to move it back and forth as far as they possibly could upon instruction. Or, under a functional context, so that was referred to as abstract movement. The more concrete movement was that they placed a drum at either end of the movement and gradually, basically brought it down, eliciting more and more supination. And what they showed is that both for the affected and less affected hand, you get much, much greater supination, pronation occurring for the actual concrete task of hitting the drum. So movement in the context of activity tends to be performed better than just simply abstract instructed movements in and of themselves. And I'd like to just point out here that most of what we know about motor learning, even in typical developed adults, healthy adults, is largely derived from laboratory tasks. We don't really, there are very few studies of how does someone learn how to dress, or how to eat with chopsticks, or how to do basically learning of activities that make up function, or these purposeful sports and things like that. These are all based upon studies that are very carefully manipulated to narrow it down to a few key variables, but in the end, what we know is that, and not actually function. And that's something to consider when we think about motor learning approaches. So, to conclude this part of the talk, the motor system physiology is highly variable, of course. There's all kinds of lesions, and the extent to which the tracts are affected and the particular motor behaviors are affected are very variable. But the impairment patterns, both in execution and planning and learning, are remarkably consistent. These particularly deficits that I've been showing you, I've yet to see particular individuals that don't have multiple, if not all, problems with all of these particular processes. I think it's important when we're doing clinical work to be kind of connecting this basic work, kind of driving our thought process, and thinking about ingredients that are connecting some of these sorts of findings, and findings that cognition and basically movement control, and very very detailed movement analysis to kind of drive our questions. So it's understanding these mechanisms of impairment and recovery will ultimately be essential for furthering our knowledge, or further, basically improving the ingredients of treatment. So we're going to take a break here, but for both talks, I'd just like to acknowledge that I've been very fortunate to work with a gifted group of students and colleagues, basically from Columbia University, Kathleen Friel, a former student, Jean Charles, who's now at Emory, Bert Steenberg in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, Lily Hung, who's a postdoc and now is a faculty member at CUNY, Yannick Blaenhoft, who is a faculty member in Brussels, and Eugene Ramakers in Maastricht. So we're going to stop here. We'll take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to kind of transition into development of rehabilitation approaches, that third circle. So, questions? Okay.
עוד פעם. ראינו בגרפים שהוא השווה בין ילד טיפיקלי לילד עם CP, שבגרף של הלואוד, כשהיה לואוד, היה הרבה פחות פער בין הביצוע של הילד הטיפיקלי לילד עם ה-CP, ולא הייתה התייחסות כל כך לגרף הזה.
Load forces? So I failed to point out that when you lift objects, basically load forces are the forces imposed by gravity. So they're not something that's under control, but basically it's a constant force by, you know, the weight of the object is basically the load force. What variable you have to manipulate is the rate of development of this load force, and then the grip force. You're able to squeeze as hard and to some extent as little, depending on the weight of the object, as you want, but typically you'll adapt it to some extent with efficiency towards the object's weight. So yeah, basically it's load forces are just physics.
First, thank you, Andy, for this wonderful lecture, and it's beautiful to see how you managed to quantify our clinical observations. I would like to ask if you have any comments on how do central pattern generator integrate into this motor planning in CP kids, if indeed they do.
Yeah, well, when we talk about motor pattern generator, most people are thinking about it in terms of lower extremity control, but of course it's the integration of arm swing and you know, and gait, and some people actually have proposed that central pattern generators are involved in basically discrete movements, you know, with this discrete movement being defined as part of what could be a cycle. I wouldn't say that it's so much the planning, but it's more the execution, because these central pattern generators largely are, or at least in animal models where they mostly have been studied in the cat and rat and so forth, are largely in the brainstem and spinal cord. And what one thing it's important to consider, and I'll show you some slides a little bit later, is when we think about motor control, motor planning, motor deficits in these individuals, we always think, well, look at the MRI, you can actually see a lesion, and you know, you can see damage to the cortical spinal tract. What we don't appreciate is that early on, that affects learning-dependent experience. That ultimately shapes the development of the growth of the cortical spinal tract, connecting the motor cortex to the termination of these tracts to the actual spinal cord. So without having sufficient activity as the symptoms of CP begin to manifest, ultimately what you're not doing is you're not innervating the spinal cord and ultimately disrupting the ability to carefully manipulate spinal pattern generators and things like that. So it's not simply a higher order you know, disorder, but I think the spinal cord is greatly involved and underappreciated.
Thank you.
Okay. We have time for maybe one more question. Oh, can't hear.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I wonder whether you managed to observe any differences in the function of the contralateral hand while focusing on one hand, following the intervention, I mean.
I don't think I understand the question. So how much does...
I wonder whether if you intervened with one hand, okay, say the right hand.
Yes.
Whether you were managed to follow any differences in the resulting functions of the contralateral hand following that intervention.
Yeah.
While you're targeting one hand only.
Yes. So I'm going to talk about in the next talk some differences between unimanual intervention and bimanual intervention. Most of what I'm presenting is focused on the affected hand, but we measure, and other people have reported to a greater extent, what happens with the less affected extremity as well. And I can tell you that there are some of these subtle improvements. There are subtle improvements when you look at the less affected hand.
Thanks a lot.
We'll talk more. Okay. So if it's okay, I'd like to actually continue it, and if you can save your questions for the next talk, just so that we have time to make it through these. So